Okay. The next thing I think we should talk about is classes. Now, normally you just think a class is a class, but in Flutter, because of the way it works, there are three main types of classes. One is your basic class. So let's make a user class, and let's say there's a string username, can't type, and then string password. Okay. So I'm getting some errors here. We can ignore that for the time being. But basically, this is like your class. These are like your variables that are used in the class. And so since these are not defined, we need to somehow define them. And so what you can do is, no, I don't want that. What you can do is you can create a constructor, which is quite common. The way you do it here is you just call the actual class, user, and then you need to define what you're going to call. So we can do this dot username, comma, this dot password. Oh, I call password first. Whoops. Okay. So what this does is this is basically referring to whatever is being passed into the class. So if like in here, I'm going to call the user class, right? So user is equal to user, and then I'm going to have my username be username, and my password can be password. So basically this username, like what God, I should probably call it something else. I should call it this. Okay. So Brownie is going to be my username, which is this username here, this username. That's going to be this. And then password is going to be this password. And what it does is it's going to automatically define username to be this and this. So instead of like doing something in Java where you have like, oh, I just realized I set the constructor backwards, so that's going to be wrong. But okay, so like in Java, you would do something like this. Can I not type today? String username, string password, and then you do it like this, and you say like username is equal to username, blah blah blah, etc. So that's what you normally do, but this is just like, because the way Flutter works, we have a lot of classes and constructors. So this is just a lot. They made a faster way to do it, basically. Just call this password, call this username. Crap. Username. Cool. So that's one way to do it. How I usually like to do it is this way. I put a curly braces around the actual definitions. So the reason I do this is because you then have to put this thing called required for both of them. So when you have these curly braces, it's saying that these are required terms, but they can also be optional if you want them to. I think if you're going to have an optional term, like for example, this, just call it UID. String UID equals this. I think you have to do it that way. Maybe. I can't remember. Primary ID can't have no values of type. Or required. I guess this way it just requires you to make it required. Anyways, the reason I use it that way is because it can get kind of confusing sometimes when you're having a lot of classes. If you notice, theme data is a class. My homepage is a class. This is build context is technically class. Scaffold. Basically, there's a lot of classes. So what I like to do is when you have it this way, you can define what the password is going to be by doing that. And then you can also define what the username is going to be like that. So that just makes it easier for you to quickly see what is what instead of having to remember what gets passed when. And that's that way. Probably look up what the way was for like if you don't want something to be required. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. But yeah, that's like the main basics of just a class itself. Any questions? Okay, cool.
So there's
Sorry, yeah, go
three
ahead.
main types of classes.
Sorry, what? And I think down here, stateful widget. Those are the two types of widgets. And everything you see in your app, all of these are widgets. So at the top, this is like, I believe they call it a nav bar, or it usually comes by default with your scaffold. So that title is a widget. The blue stuff is a widget. This debug thing is part of a widget. This plus button, the text, everything you see, the white space, all of that are widgets. So what are widgets then? Widgets is, well, yeah, it's what you see, but then there's this thing called stateless and stateful widgets, right? So stateless widgets is basically something that you know is not going to change at all when you build it. For example, in this case, what they have is their theme data and then where they redirect to, right? So what they're doing is they're defining this theme data, which you can like set up colors and stuff like that, color scheme, blah, 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 fonts, title, text, like, and then you can have like a text theme, I think they call it. No, text style, that's what they call it. But basically, it's something that you know for sure is not going to change on your page. So something that doesn't require human interaction or human input. That is what a stateless widget is. So I guess a good starting point whenever you're making any page or UI or something that someone's going to see and it's a class, just start off as a stateless widget. And if you need a stateful widget, then you can easily change it to a stateful widget. And so what is a stateful widget then? A stateful widget is when you need actual human interaction, like me touching this button. Every time I touch this button, something is changing. And when it changes, that's what's telling Flutter, hey, I want to show this number to be 11 or 12 or 13, etc. And so what's happening is when I press this button, there's this function that's being called or triggered, and it runs the stuff in that function. And so there's this thing that's storing the number, the current value. They call it counter here, right? And so by default, you start at 0. So like if I like hot restart real quick, it should probably start at, yeah, it starts at 0, right? So that's your default value. And when I hit this plus button, it is changing the value of counter to be 1. But if you're in a stateless widget, you've already drawn the app. So like what happens is when you open a page, it just draws that page as it is, top to bottom. So it just goes through all of the code and it draws your page for you. So when you change something, it's not going to rebuild the entire thing again. That's why we have stateful widgets. What it does is it looks at what you've changed, which is this set state function here. You call this set state function, and it's going to, and whatever you change here, Flutter will automatically check in this actual page or this screen, what is being changed when you change your counter. And then it will only change that specific widget. So it's going to only change this number. Everything else is staying the same. So it's kind of like, it's basically a good way to save resources and not rebuild the entire page every time that you do this. So yeah, whenever you have a stateful widget, if you ever change some state, you use the set state function and then you pass in whatever you want to change that is like saved in your actual class. And we'll have like a lot of stateful and stateless widgets. So as we move forward, you should be able to find a whole bunch of ways to use them. Cool. Any questions so far about like stateful and stateless widgets and how they work?